I don't know about you ladies, but have you been in a Facebook group full of single or married women complaining about how the only thing men want and care about is sex? Are you like most women who think that this is true? That if you simply feed them and fuck them, everything's going to be good? If so, I've got something to share with you today to blow this limiting belief up. Men are way more complex than most of us give them credit for. And I am on a mission to help you see them as the complex and the intricate beings that they are, and how limiting that the perpetuation of this narrative is for many men who indeed do care about your emotions, yours and theirs, and how it really is more than just sex for them as well. Also, you've likely heard me talk about the 8 different types of female orgasms from episode 174 and the 7 types from episode 15 before I knew and experienced the eighth for myself. But you've definitely never heard me talk about the different types of male orgasms. So, if you're someone who doesn't know what you just don't know about pleasure, like most of us, then I want you to tune into the full episode. I know it's a little long, but Cam is an absolute rock star and an expert in the sexuality space for men, completely changing the way men experience their masculinity and sexuality. Cam hails from Australia, spending his college years in the US of A and having a lot of meaningless sex with some ladies back in his younger days. At just 19 years old, he found himself questioning his masculinity and struggling with performance anxiety that manifested as, premature ejaculation, some erectile disappointment, and watching too much porn until he fractured his spine and he started doing Pilates, yoga, massage, breathwork, therapy, and meditation. And for the first time in his life, he started listening to his body, yay, and having massive breakthroughs around his own emotional intelligence and sexuality. He then went on to study psychology and to become a clinical sex therapist. He started exploring plant medicine, got ordained as a Buddhist monk, and eventually settled down in Australia again to do a degree in sexology, which led him to become a sex coach with a spiritual tantric flair for the past six-ish years now. He's got a rocking Instagram account. You can go follow him at Cam Fraser, that you should definitely follow to learn all things sexuality and pleasure for men, as well as a podcast of his own, Men, Sex, and Pleasure with Cam Fraser. In today's episode, you're going to learn the major myths around men's sexuality, such as the myth of arousal and erection, the myth that men are more sexual than women, the myth around men and the anal and prostate play making them gay, the myth that orgasm and ejaculation are the same, the myth that men are more visual and therefore need porn in their life, and the myth of the term sex drive. You're also going to learn the truth about testosterone and how it affects men's sexuality. You're going to learn a lot about resolving mismatched libido and relationships in this episode, too. You're going to learn the erotic menu for your sex life and other things to do than penis and vagina sex. You're going to learn the 3 different types of male orgasm, the number 1 trick to separate orgasm from ejaculation, and how you as a woman can help lead your male partner into becoming multiorgasmic himself. This is the Multiorgasmic Mama, the podcast for high-achieving moms to have sex worth putting the energy in for. I'm Tilly Storm, a holistic sex and intimacy coach, and it's my mission to help you want sex again, to have better orgasms, and to feel confident and sexy so you experience more pleasure in the bedroom and beyond. All right, Cam, tell us a little bit about you, what you do, and why you do it.
I'm just super passionate about just opening up this lid on what we think of as masculinity and sexuality and the intersection between those 2 things, and try and bring a little bit of the spirituality side of things in, the esoteric side of things, and then also the academic and research-based side of things as well, because I think it's important to have a bit of a crossover there. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell, as much of a nutshell as I can put it in.
I would love for you to tell me a little bit about some of the myths that your brand is built off of around masculinity. Share with us some of those things, and if you could tell a bunch of women and some men listening right now, like, this is totally inaccurate, like, don't pigeonhole yourself into these stereotypes, what would that be?
Yeah, okay. So some major ones that I work with, or that I try and debunk, for want of a better word, are like one of the major ones is around arousal non-concordance. So this idea that like an erection equals arousal, and that isn't necessarily the case. So obviously there's an overlap there where arousal and erection happen together, and that's in alignment. But a person with a penis, or a guy, because I work with cis men, a guy can have an erection but not be aroused, just the same way that he can be aroused and not have an erection. The two don't always line up. And it's kind of similar to, if you have a vulva and you get lubricated, if you have a vagina and you get lubricated, you can be aroused and not be lubricated, and you can be, producing lubrication but not be very aroused. And so there's a misalignment there. And typically there's a bit more misalignment for women than there is for men, but there is still that non-concordance. So, and so like that seems like a pretty straightforward thing to kind of understand. But when you start to like extrapolate that to its extremes, I suppose, one extreme is like the guys who are like really turned on and like wanting to connect with their partner, wanting to be sexual, and their partner's really wanting to be sexual with them, and they're like in the heat of the moment, but they don't have an erection, and they're like, what the fuck's wrong with me? Something's wrong with me, or something's wrong with my partner. Maybe I don't like them. Maybe I am not turned on by them. Like, and they start to question all these things, and there's a lot of anxiety induced by it. That's like one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is, and this is a bit of a trigger warning for people, is like when a guy gets sexually assaulted and he has an erection, right? He didn't consent to it. He's definitely not aroused by it, subjectively, psychologically, but the body's having a physiological response of arousal. And, so some men that I've worked with have had an experience like this where they felt betrayed by their body because their body has an erection. And, there's about 20% of guys that when they're sexually assaulted have also had an ejaculation as well, had an orgasm as part of their assault. And so like there's a story there that like, oh, well, maybe he enjoyed it, or maybe maybe it wasn't assault because his body had this response. Mm-hmm. And so like, it's really important to talk about that as well. So that's a major one. And it seems like very simple on the surface, but when we start to extrapolate it, we go into some pretty intense areas. Another one is that like men are always supposed to be sexual, right? That men are, with this kind of twofold. The first is like that men are more sexual than women. Like that's a pretty strong narrative in the West, at least. And that men, because they're more sexual than women, are always sexual as well. That guys are just ready to have sex at the drop of a hat. And sure, there are men out there like that. I'm not saying that there aren't. But this idea that all men are supposed to have like a really high sex drive that's unyielding and unwavering and unrelenting and will always say yes to sex as well is problematic for a bunch of reasons. The first is that like we know that there's plenty of women out there that have a higher sex drive than men, or that want and desires. And so that causes issues, obviously, in a relationship. If there's an expectation that the guy is supposed to want to have sex more often than his female partner. But then also like it causes some issues, or it becomes problematic. Like if a guy starts to say no to sex, or if he puts up a boundary and says like, oh, I'm actually not in the mood. Because a story comes up for him of being like, what's wrong with me? I don't want to have sex right now. And so he might cross his own boundary, and even though he didn't want to have sex, he might just do it anyway because he feels like that's expected of him. Or he might escalate sex because even though his partner and him might not necessarily be into it, he might think, well, this is expected of me to be sexual, so I guess I'm just going to keep on going here, and that's where we're going to go. Or another story can pop up of like, if he says no after she's initiated, then very typical one is, what are you, gay? Like, is there something wrong with you? And again, the label of gay is used there as kind of like not as an insult in that kind of regard. Sometimes it is, I suppose, but it's seen as like a bad thing to be gay. And again, that's this kind of story of homophobia, which again is a big one for a lot of guys. That leads into another story around like pleasure, like guys that are interested in prostate play or anal play or any type of pleasure that's outside of just their cock and balls are seen as weird, or are seen as if it's anything to do with their ass, that somehow that makes them gay for some reason, even though that's not how sexual orientation or, sexual behavior actually works. And so that's one I'm really passionate about, talking about. Is like, firstly, there's nothing wrong with being gay, so who fucking cares if it did make you gay? But secondly, it doesn't. So, learn about that. So that's another big one. Then, I mean, there's heaps. I can keep on going. There's the idea that like ejaculation and orgasm are the same, but they're actually two separate physiological processes. I'm really passionate about like debunking that, not only at that like the client level or working with people, but also at like the sex therapy level as well, because in sex therapy we still use this model of Masters and Johnson's human sexual response, which still conflates orgasm and ejaculation, and there's not really any models out there that show the distinction between those two things. So I think that's really important to talk about, and like learning how to have multiple orgasms and things like this, but that's a whole nother conversation. And yeah, I mean, if people are really interested in like going deep into these, there's a fantastic book called Not Always in the Mood by a woman who's a researcher in Canada called Sarah Hunter Murray. And she's got, it's fantastic. It's for heterosexual couples. And it's just like literally all the major myths about male sexuality and how to navigate them with a partner. She's a couples therapist and a couples researcher. Like another one is about porn. Like, men are more visual and men need porn in their life, and like it's, integral to their sexuality. That's just not true as well. And this idea that men are more visual that's a myth as well. It's, it's socially conditioned rather than it being, a evolutionarily biological trait that men have. Like that's not a real thing. So there's heaps of them. And I'm passionate about like calling them out and, offering up an alternative, maybe explaining where they come from. I think that's important for us to kind of realize a little bit, is like, okay, why do we think that? Like, is there any truth to that? Maybe it's a stereotype for a reason. And then kind of like pulling that apart and being like, well, here's actually a new story that you can tell yourself about male sexuality, about men. Because I work with a lot of guys, of course, but a lot of these guys that I work with, because they're heterosexual, they have female partners. And so not only are we kind of rewriting the stories for him, but then he, by proxy of being in a relationship with her, kind of does a bit of rewriting of her stories, because we have the same stories about masculinity and sexuality. We aren't being taken to different classrooms anymore, I suppose. I was when I was in high school for sex ed. I was taken into a different classroom to the girls. But we get the same stories. We get the same ideas, like this is what men are supposed to be, this is what women are supposed to be, and those things are propagated by each of us. And so we both have a responsibility there to kind of check our stories and what expectations we're kind of placing on our partner. So that was a bit of a rant, but there was a few things in there. Hopefully that kind of like lays the foundation for some conversations.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I relate to so much of that, and it only takes being in the dating world for a very short amount of time to realize how many of those myths are totally not even real or true. All right, ladies, let's dive into this myth that men are the ones that are supposed to initiate and women aren't sexual.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing is to acknowledge is that's like a massive story that we have in society, right? That like men are supposed to be the initiators, are supposed to be the active participants in sex, are they're supposed to be the ones that pursue sex, and women are supposed to be the passive gatekeepers, the ones that, desire less sex. And so like they're the ones that kind of say yes or no to his advances. So that's a major story like that we first have to acknowledge. So it requires a lot of unpacking and unlearning. Like I want to just, preface that and say that just by listening to this conversation right now, it's probably not going to undo all the conditioning that you've learned about that particular story, because it's a big one. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is like, okay, so it's important to acknowledge then that so I'll talk about the male sex drive, and sex drive is a bit of a weird term because it's kind of like made up. We just kind of made up this idea that sex drive is a thing, when really it's just like sexuality and do you desire sex and do you have like an interest in it and things like that. There's no real like drive, I suppose, biologically speaking, to be like to have sex a certain amount of times. Like it's an interesting thing. But like men's desire for sex does fluctuate, and oftentimes it gets conflated with like his testosterone levels. So like I will very commonly get a message from a guy on social media and say, hey, I feel like something's wrong with me. I don't want sex as often as my partner does. I've gone and checked my testosterone levels. Like that's without a doubt, like all the time a guy will say, yeah, I've checked my testosterone levels and nothing's wrong. Because we conflate testosterone with quote unquote sex drive, with libido. Now, while there is a correlation between those two things, testosterone isn't the only thing that's responsible for how much you desire sex. For example, we've got estradiol, there's dopamine, there's cortisol levels, there's prolactin, there's all these other different types of neurochemicals that impact sex drive and your desire to have sex. But if we're taking testosterone like the way a lot of people do and saying that it's the sole thing that's the reason for people having a sex drive the way it is, like testosterone fluctuates, right? And so it fluctuates on a daily basis. It's high in the morning, it's low in the evening. Testosterone fluctuates on a it has a rhythm, a 30-day cycle and a 40-day cycle. It has these rhythms. It has a seasonal rhythm as well. So it's really high or statistically significantly high in winter and lower in summer. So when it's cooler, testosterone's higher. When it's hotter, testosterone's lower. So it's got the seasonal variation as well. And so, and then it declines progressively over the age of 20. It starts to go down progressively each decade. So, if we're saying that guys are supposed to have, unwavering, unyielding sex drive, and we're saying that testosterone is responsible for sex drive, then that doesn't equivocate, right? Because testosterone has all these, like humans do, has all these cycles. It's a cyclical, we're all cyclical beings, at least in my opinion. So, acknowledging that is, I think, really important as well, to kind of start accepting this new story or rewriting this new story that there are going to be fluctuations. There's going to be times where he might be really desirous for sex, and there's going to be other times where he's maybe not so much. There's also a story wrapped up in this as well that and I get this from a lot of men, that now that they're in a relationship, they should only want to have sex with their partner and not masturbate anymore, and all their sexual needs need to be fulfilled by their partner. And so this might be a similar story that some women have as well in a relationship.
So hard.
Especially, right, yeah, right, that like their sexual needs can only be met by their male partner and maybe can't be met by themselves. And so when there's a discrepancy in like libido, for example, when one's higher than the other, in terms of like their partners, there could be a conversation around like, well, I'm maybe not able to fulfill all those sexual needs that you have. Is there an opportunity there to explore that by yourself, or for us to like find other avenues for doing that maybe don't involve as much involvement from the person with the lesser amount of desire? So, so there's a story there around self-pleasure within a relationship, which is important to deconstruct. And then like, if we're talking about bridging that gap between, a person with a higher libido and a person with a lower libido, and this is true regardless of which gender has the higher and lower, but it's, when I talk to couples about the way that they meet their sexual needs with one another, I use this analogy called the erotic menu. And the analogy is as follows: like when you're hungry, you choose from a menu a meal to eat with your partner. So when you're horny, you choose with your partner from your erotic menu a quote unquote meal to quote unquote eat with your partner. But for a lot of couples, the only meal that's on their erotic menu is penis and vagina sex, is penetrative sex. And so that might be your favorite meal, right? That might be an amazing, fantastic meal. It's a pretty big meal, right? And if you're maybe not as hungry as your partner, then that big meal, or even if it's just the only meal on the menu, might be not what you're looking for that evening, right? You might be hungry, but not that hungry. Or you might be hungry, but you're in the mood for something else. And so, when it comes to choosing something off your erotic menu, if there's only one thing on there, it can firstly get dull pretty quickly. It's like eating your favorite meal, for when you actually are hungry. Like it might be a great meal, right? I really love tiramisu, for example. But if I eat tiramisu every single mealtime, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and every time I'm hungry, I'm going to get sick and tired of tiramisu pretty quickly. And so there's like an invitation here to add things to your erotic menu to, if you're wanting to connect and meet each other's sexual desires, what are some other things that are available to you that aren't necessarily penis and vagina, P&V sex? And so, that requires some creativity, it requires some spontaneity as well, some flexibility, some, just some inspiration as well a little bit. And so I often talk to guys about like, if they're, for example, not, if they're the partner with like the lower desire for sex, or they can't quote unquote keep up with their female partner, I'll start to talk to them about, okay, what are some other ways that you can help get her sexual needs met that don't involve you having to rely on your cock? Because that's, what a lot of the pressure that a lot of men feel when it comes to sex comes down to the fact that like, oh God, I'm like going to have to use my cock again, or like, maybe it's not reliable, maybe they're having some erection issues, and some there's performance anxiety there. And so there's a lot of guys feel a lot of pressure and anxiety and expectation for themselves to perform, and whether they put that expectation and pressure on themselves, or whether they kind of, surreptitiously feel it from their partner, there's still a lot of guys dealing with this pressure to perform. And because, and this is like, a lot of this is interrelated, but it's because a lot of people, couples, men, women, just people in general, have this idea that like pleasure has to come from an erect penis, right? And that if there's no erection, then sex can't happen, right? Or if there's an ejaculation, then sex has to finish. Like these, like who made those rules, right? That like if, and that idea, by the way, is called phallocentrism. Like that idea that if he's got an erection, then sex is good to go. If he doesn't, then, well, sex is off the table. If he's ejaculated, then that's the end of sex, and we can't be sexual after that. Like the idea that sex is predicated upon what the penis can and can't do is limiting for both parties. So one of the strategies that I help couples kind of develop is like how to be sexual with one another that doesn't involve his penis, for example, because it can take a lot of pressure off of this, what he might be feeling. And so by doing that, he can, typically what happens is, because he feels less pressure to perform and for his cock to do something, there's a bit more freedom for him to be like, oh, okay, I can use a toy, or I can use my fingers, I can use my tongue, I can be sexual and intimate in a bunch of different ways. And it frees up that desire to come out a little bit more, as opposed to like him maybe not wanting to have as much sex because he's worried that he's going to get, he's going to have trouble getting an erection, or he's going to come too quickly, or all those other resistances that might be blocking his desire for sex in the first place. So, so if you're a woman listening to this, that can also be quite helpful, is like being a bit of a leader in that sense, I suppose, and being like, hey, we can be sexual in other ways. It doesn't have to look like penetrative sex. Like it doesn't have to involve your cock. Let's explore some other things and keep that like lightheartedness, keep that playfulness, keep that like not so seriousness, I suppose. My opinion is sex is supposed to be playful and fun and pleasurable. And I think you're supposed to laugh during sex as well. Like I don't think people are laughing enough during sex. So
I love that.
if you can,
Yes.
right. So if you can instill that, like, and if you can invite that into your like relationship with your partner, and take that pressure off and make it a bit more fun and enjoyable for the two of you, that's typically a strategy that I help, especially the guys that I work with. I help them frame, sexual leadership in that way, as like kind of creating a space where you're leading by vulnerability, you're kind of leading by example, and then helping invite your partner into that. The image that I kind of paint is like, you're diving into a lake and, testing out the water and saying to your partner, hey, the water's fine. Come on in, come and join me in here. Like you've taken the plunge and led by example, and then you're inviting your partner in to join you.
Thank you, Cam, for that amazing breakdown of sexual myths for men and giving us so many new ways to think of men and their sexuality. Now, for those of us creatively challenged, what are other options that we can try when we have mismatched libidos, for example, and maybe something other than the plain old penis and vagina sex?
Something that I wanted to share is like, this is just a simple strategy for people that are like having a difference in libido, for example, is like take an inventory of like what you think your libido is. So do this separately from your partner, but suggest it as an idea. On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you rate your own libido? And then on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you rate your partner's libido or like desire for sex? And then compare notes, because you might be surprised. You might rate yourself really, really high, and your partner might rate yourself like somewhere in the middle range. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. Why is that? Is there maybe a miscommunication issue happening as well of like, I'm not picking up on the cues of my partner who wants to have more sex, right? Because again, because of this internalized story that that men are supposed to be the initiators of sex, a lot of guys aren't tuned in to cues from their female partner about this, that she wants sex, that she maybe is in the mood. Again, because there's a lot of shaming of women that are really desirous of sex and want to have sex, they can be quite subtle with their cues as well. Even though they might think they're being quite overt with their cues, it might feel like they are because they're stepping into like, I'm actually in the mood for sex, I want to have sex. But because there's this internalization of like, you know, it's bad, quote unquote, wrong to be a sexual woman. A lot of guys aren't used to like picking up on that from their female partners, and there might be some miscommunication there. So a conversation about like where you both think you are and whether there's any mismatches there might lead to a conversation about like, when I do this, that means I'm in the mood to have sex. And your partner might be like, oh shit, I didn't know that. And you're like, oh my God, I've been doing this for like 3 years. How did you not know that? And it might be an opportunity to then go, all right, well, now that I know, I actually do want to have sex more often. I just didn't realize that was when you were in the mood. So that can facilitate like some light bulb moments for couples as well. Just talking about signals and those kind of desire discrepancies. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great idea. I love that. Okay.
Cool.
Well, this is the Multiorgasmic podcast. And when I was looking at those stats, I will tell you the number one episode is, well, actually it was deep throating techniques and how to give orgasmic blowjobs. That's the number one episode. The second was the 8 different types of female orgasm.
Nice.
So yes, I always talk about, I just like to educate women on what they don't even know is possible in their body. But I would love to hear you tell us a little bit about men's experiences of orgasm and how prostate orgasm is a thing.
So I like to start by saying that, neurologically speaking, men can have at minimum 3 different types of orgasms, right? And then that's just, we're using the nervous system as a barometer there. Then we can talk about the muscular system and all these other, we're talking about energetic orgasms and all this other stuff, but like, just keep it basic. We'll start with the neurology. We can orgasm through the pudendal nerve, which is the nerve that runs through the perineum, that space in between the genitals and the anus. It's connected to the sympathetic nervous system, and it's responsible for ejaculation. So it's sometimes known as an ejaculatory orgasm. The next nerve, as part of these 3 ways, is the pelvic nerve. The pelvic nerve is innervated, not innervated, but it's connected to the rectum and like the hips and the lower abdominal muscles. And so we can have an orgasm through like rim jobs, for example, and anal stimulation, and through massage of the general pelvic area. And then there's also the hypogastric nerve, and the hypogastric nerve innervates the prostate. So it surrounds the prostate, and the prostate is a small walnut-sized gland just behind the bladder. Typically, it's stimulated through anal penetration. And the beautiful thing about the hypogastric nerve in general and prostate orgasms is that the hypogastric nerve primarily carries parasympathetic fibers, which means it's part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you remember, I said ejaculation is part of the sympathetic nervous system. It's a sympathetic reflex, for example. And what happens after an ejaculation is a lot of guys enter a refractory period. Is that period of time after he comes where he loses his erection, doesn't really feel super aroused. He feels satiated, right? He feels like his sexual desire goes away. And takes about 20 minutes for him to get excited and aroused and get an erection and be able to ejaculate again. There's various reasons for that, but that's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about. However, a hypogastric nerve that innervates the prostate doesn't include an ejaculation because it bypasses that ejaculatory reflex. So you can have a prostate orgasm or a pelvic orgasm, depending on where you're stimulating, and completely miss that refractory period. And so you can have another prostate orgasm and another one until you're fed up with having them, and you and you want to stop because it doesn't trigger the ejaculation reflex. Of course, you can have then a blended orgasm, which is like an ejaculatory orgasm with the prostate stimulation, and so you can get this beautiful mix of the two, because our sexual functioning is this beautiful blend between the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of the nervous system. But that's at minimum the three types of orgasms that people with male biology can have. And I'm really, passionate about talking about prostate orgasms in particular, just purely because there's a lot of story around it. Firstly, like what prostate stimulation means for guys, like does it turn them gay? That's not true. There's no switch up there that you press that just changes your sexual identity. That's not how it works. But it's one of the simplest ways of becoming a multi-orgasmic man, for example. There's strategies out there like Mantak Chia talks about, where you've got to press and squeeze and like divert energy and move all things around and do all these Taoist sexual practices. And you can do that, for sure. You can do that. And I teach a lot of those practices. There's some practices that I don't teach, which I found to be detrimental, like the $1 million point technique, where you're pressing up into the perineum. That's not a very useful strategy. It does more damage than it does good. But if you're wanting to learn simply how to become multi-orgasmic, it's learn how to have a prostate orgasm. And typically what I do with my clients, the ones that are specifically looking to learn how to become multi-orgasmic, is I'll encourage them to explore their prostate, because once they have a prostate orgasm that doesn't involve a refractory period, that experience clicks for them. And their body goes, oh, this is a thing I can do now, as opposed to like them trying and practicing and trying to have like a non-ejaculatory orgasm by doing all the practices and techniques and squeezes and things like that, which they can eventually do. But what I find is that all that stuff that they're doing for that particular type of non-ejaculatory orgasm becomes a lot easier once their body has that light bulb moment of being like, oh, this is something that I can do. And typically the thing that gets them over the line is that prostate orgasm. And then once they've had that, the kind of Pandora's box has been opened, so to speak, and then they go back and do these other practices, and they realize that they're a lot more successful with those practices at learning how to separate ejaculation and orgasm, because their body has that like almost like muscle memory, that trigger to be like, oh, okay, I can do this now, and it lends itself a lot more easily. So that's important to recognize as well. I said this before, that ejaculation and orgasm are two separate physiological processes. So you can ejaculate and have an orgasm together at the same time, or you can ejaculate without an orgasm, so a non-orgasmic ejaculation, which I don't think gets talked about enough. Guys that have an ejaculation, but there's actually no heightened peak state of pleasure associated with it. Typically it just like dribbles out as well. But then on the other hand, what people are really interested in is the non-ejaculatory orgasm, so an orgasm that doesn't involve an ejaculation. And so some strategies for doing that is like, the most simplest way I can put this is, think about what you or your partner does when they ejaculate, right? So take an inventory of like the physical manifestations of an ejaculation. What are some of those things? Well, I've spoken to a lot of guys about the way that they come, and some things that are very common is they'll hold their breath, or they'll breathe quite quickly, or they'll breathe up into their chest quite shallowly. Their heart rate goes up because of that. Their temperature goes up because of that. Maybe they're squeezing and they're pushing and they're like trying to force that ejaculation out, right? And there's this like holding sensation, this pushing and squeezing sensation, this tension that's built up. It's known as myotonia, that involuntary tension in the body. There's the pulsing, the rhythmic pulsing, squeezing as well. There's sometimes guys will close their eyes, and there's all these things. So you can take an inventory of all the things that you do when you ejaculate. And then the little thought experiment I have here is like, okay, take all those things, take them out of the erotic context, and apply them to a guy who was just walking down the street, right? You saw a guy all of a sudden just like tense up, freeze up, hold his breath, like, tightening, elevated heart rate, elevated temperature, like squeezing and holding. You think that guy's having an anxiety attack, like it's a pretty anxiety inducing thing to see as well. And so I often say that ejaculation is really a pleasurable anxiety attack.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because it's a really strong trigger for that sympathetic nervous system, right? So sympathetic nervous system, for people that are familiar, is the fight or flight response, or it's an abbreviation for the 5 Fs, which is to feed, to fuck, to flee, to fight, and to there's one more in there, to freeze. And so the sympathetic nervous system gets really triggered when ejaculation happens. So if you're trying to have an orgasm that doesn't involve an ejaculation, very simply put, do the opposite of everything that you do when you ejaculate. Mm-hmm. So instead of holding your breath and elevating the breath up into the chest and, squeezing and holding and breathing, do the opposite of all that. So slow the breath down as much as you can. Breathe down into your diaphragm, down into your belly, right down into your hara, and relax as much as possible. So let go of that tension that you're holding on to. Try not to push and to squeeze, but to let go and surrender. Slow the heart rate down, lower the temperature. Take your time rather than trying to build and build and build to get to this end goal. Try and expand and expand and expand, and trying to hold more of that, sexual energy that you might be feeling, or more of that arousal, more of that pleasure. Try and hold it rather than trying to do something with it, which is oftentimes what leads to an ejaculation. So one of the reasons why, as guys, we get to the point of ejaculation relatively quickly is because our body is like a sponge. And just like a sponge soaks up water, our body soaks up arousal, really, or it soaks up tension. And tension is not a bad thing. Nick, who's my teacher, is a structural engineer, and so he loves this idea of tension not being a bad thing, because you need tension, right? Tension is necessary for buildings to stay upright. And so we can think of like sexual tension being a good thing, right? It creates that spark and that arousal and that chemistry and that pleasure. But our body's really good at soaking up all types of tension, not just the quote unquote good tension like sexual tension. It's good at soaking up like anxiety and stress and, tension from social media and tension from work and all this other stuff. And so our body, like a sponge, when it's waterlogged, our body is like tension logged, right? Because it's from day to day, we're living in this like sympathetic dominance state where we're constantly, looking at notifications and, got deadlines, and we're in a global pandemic. So there's kind of stress coming at us from everywhere. And so our body is really good at just like holding on to that. And then when we get into a sexual space or a sexual environment with our partner, or even by ourselves, we're trying to, from that place of being tension logged, we're trying to pour some more tension on top of that. We're trying to pour some more sexual tension on top of the already existing tension that's there. And what happens when we try and pour more water onto a sponge that's waterlogged? The sponge leaks. And this is exactly the same for like people that ejaculate, is like they get to their capacity real quickly because their body's already in this state of like arousal. And arousal not necessarily being explicitly sexual arousal, but arousal being like a state of sympathetic dominance, right, in their body. And so, what do you do if you want to pour lots of water onto a sponge? You wring it out first, right? Like you empty all of that existing water there, all that stagnant water. So you got to do the same thing with your body, is release as much tension as possible. Like bring yourself down to a baseline of arousal to begin with, right? Physiological arousal, by doing some slow breathing, by doing some fucking yoga, by doing some breath work, by doing whatever it is that allows you to relax. Could be a massage before you start to build that tension back up, before you start to build all that really beautiful sexual tension back up, and all that pleasure and all that arousal that feels really erotic. And, within that as well, do that as slowly as you can, right? So really pay attention to those levels of arousal, because a lot of guys go from 0 to 10 like that. Yeah. And they don't notice all those really beautiful steps in between. They don't know what it's like to simmer at like a 7 or an 8 and to stay in that really beautiful, mellowed but like erotic state for a long time. And so one of the practices I give to the guys that I work with is like masturbate for 20 minutes or self-pleasure for 20 minutes, but try and keep yourself like turning over at like an 8 for a good 10 minutes, right? And they might have to start at like 1 minute because it's like really difficult for them, but then build it up to 3 minutes and then 5 minutes and then 10 minutes and then 20 minutes and see if you can hold yourself in that state for a long period of time. It's one of the practices of edging, as opposed to the other practice, which is build up as close as you can to the edge and then stop and then lower it back down and then build up again and then stop and lower it back down. That's the other alternative. Mm-hmm. So that's a strategy. If you're wanting to learn how to become, or even if you're a partner, if you're a woman and your male partner is wanting to learn how to have different orgasms and different sexual experiences, you can help lead him in that by going, hey, let's make a decision not to ejaculate today. Let's just explore your pleasure and like see what else there is there, and give me feedback where you're at. Like, how close are you to ejaculating? And once you kind of invite that communication, that feedback, you can say, all right, he say, I'm getting to a 9, I'm getting to a 10, I'm getting pretty close. Okay, cool. We're going to pull back. We're going to stop directly stimulating your cock, which is often how ejaculation comes about, is through direct penile stimulation, and start keeping that pleasure going, but not as intensely. So maybe, stimulating around his genitals, maybe the thighs, maybe the lower abdomen, maybe even like his bum if he's into it, or his nipples. Like a lot of guys are into nipples, they just have never had them played with, so they don't really know, or just any other area that feels pleasurable for him, because it keeps the pleasure there, but it doesn't directly stimulate him to the point to ejaculation. So what sometimes happens is, if you're doing that ticking over of pleasure that isn't involving his genitals, firstly, experientially kind of creates new stories of like, oh, I don't need my penis to be involved in order to experience pleasure, because that's a really big story for a lot of guys. That's really limiting for a lot of couples. But it also, what can sometimes happen is you have a bit of a happy accident where like that pleasure will kind of tick over into him having like almost like a full body experience of orgasm, because you're involving other areas of his body and he's already in that heightened state of arousal. And so the body kind of goes into an orgasmic response, but doesn't involve an ejaculation. And a lot of guys go, what the fuck just happened, right? It's oftentimes a very like I said, a happy accident. They go, oh, that was new and weird and interesting, and I'm still erect. Like, what the hell is going on? And so it ends up being this like really beautiful experience that you as a female partner can help your male partner have.
Wow. So many great tips there, not only for the men listening to this, but also for you ladies who have a male partner, so you can help them become multiorgasmic too. Any last tips for us, Cam?
My cornerstone piece of advice is just like, be curious. Like, your body is so much more capable than you think it is at experiencing a multitude of different types of pleasure. So just like have that curiosity, have that playfulness, like turn things into fun little games and experimentations with your partner, and just lean into that. Like sex is supposed to be fun. Have a laugh. Don't take yourself too seriously. And that's a pretty good cornerstone to build a sex life on, I think, anyway.
Amazing. Now, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to go follow Cam on Instagram at the Cam Fraser. Sorry, it has a the in it. And take a listen to his podcast, Men, Sex, and Pleasure as well. Thanks so much for joining this amazing conversation, and we will see you next week. Chances are, if you hear my voice right now, you might be a woman who struggles with lack of libido or desire, doesn't find sex that fulfilling or satisfying, or that's so busy and in your head that it's really challenging to drop in and actually enjoy sex when it happens. Yes, this podcast is here to help you with that. In each episode, I will be sharing everything I know to help you experience more pleasure in your sex life. But let's face it, simply obtaining more information isn't going to change anything about your sex life. The thing is, being a high-achieving mom who's already in her head a lot and is strapped for time and energy, more information is not what you need, sweetheart. Alternatively, learning to rewire your body and your brain so you can get out of your head, be in your body, and enjoy yourself is required. If you're really serious and committed to doing the embodiment practices, the somatic and the nervous system reprogramming, so you can experience epic sex in the bedroom and beyond, then I invite you to consider my Sensually Embodied Woman program. This is my signature program to teach and to coach high-achieving moms like you. And it's how over 70 women have experienced a massive increase in their sexual desire and pleasure in the bedroom and beyond in less than 4 months. Through the program, you'll get deep, intimate coaching from me for 16 weeks, where I'll be able to personally guide you through your specific sex life and relationship struggles. And you'll also instantly join a sisterhood of other high-level women going through the same things to support you on the journey. On top of that, in addition to all of the coaching, the community, the accountability, the teachings, and the audio-guided embodiment practices and meditations, when you join the Sensually Embodied Woman program, you'll get lifetime access to our member library with new bonus content that we're continually adding in. And by the way, the program does help you to become a multi-orgasmic mama too. So yes, you can rely on just the information I share with you here. And yes, you may get the pleasure education you never got growing up. You may grow the ovaries enough to break the ice with your partner and have a meaningful conversation about your sex life. Or you could take the shortcut and get the support you're going to need right off the bat. So if you're ready to commit to doing what it takes to have epic sex and pleasure in the next 4 months, then click the link in the show notes and fill out an application for the Sensually Embodied Woman program. And you'll be on your way to joining my magical world of multi-orgasmic motherhood and fast-tracking your journey to a thriving sex life and relationship today. Once again, hit the link in the show notes to apply for the Sensually Embodied Woman, and I'll see you there in the program.